What forms the apparatus of capture are two operations always found in the convergent modes: direct comparison and monopolistic appropriation. Today, we're going to talk about alcoholism. Hello everyone, welcome to Flickr Theory Reviews. I'm your host, Tadas Vinokur. It's a beautiful day today in London. The sun is shining and we're continuing our journey through 1,000 Plateaus by exploring a new chapter. The name of the chapter is Apparatus of Capture. This chapter is particularly important to those who are interested in the analysis of signs or systems of signification. Just like the Faciality or Postulates of Linguistics or several regimes of science chapters, this chapter explores how systems of signification organize our material relations. More importantly, Deleuze and Guattari look at the way in which capitalism, money, urban centers organize the space where we live, work, and exchange goods. Firstly, we have to know that Apparatus of Capture chapter continues the set of propositions that were laid out in the nomadology plateau. In the Apparatus of Capture chapter, we therefore start with where Deleuze and Guattari left off in the nomadology chapter. We start at the proposition number 10. Number 10. Well, proposition 10 carries on the discussion of sovereignty and its two poles: magician emperor on the one side and priest-jurist-king on the other side. Well, what are these two poles of sovereignty? Essentially, these are two different styles of ruling the nation. The magician emperor is the violent, despotic master, while the jurist-priest is more composed, a more moderate, reserved legislator. These two styles of state control also imply different forms of social organization. Magician emperor rules by virtue of people's strict bond with the sovereign, while the Jewish priest manages by virtue of the pact. In other words, the Jewish priest rules by virtue of people's consent. Jewish priest proceeds by treaties, pacts, and contracts. In other words, magician emperor is the more Machiavellian force, if you will, while Jewish priest is more Lockean force. It is important to note, however, that these two styles of state management, these two heads of state, always work together. They are two sides of the same coin, the state. Deleuze and Guattari write, "The magician king and the Jewish priest, they're the principal elements of a state apparatus that proceeds by a 1-2, distributes binary distinctions, and forms a milieu of interiority. It is a double articulation that makes the state apparatus into a stratum. In other words, the state can function only because the despot and the legislator work together. They both work together." Another very important concept that Deleuze and Guattari discuss in the 10th proposition is the war machine. The war machine is the force that resists capitalist axiomatic. In other words, the war machine is the tool of the nomad. The war machine is a collection of nomads who continually resist state control. The word war can be a little bit misleading here, in that the war machine does not engage in war per se. It simply undermines the normalizing power of states by employing perpetual mutation or metamorphosis. So how does the state, or the two heads of state, the legislator and the despot, interact with the war machine? The state functions within a striated, rigid, clearly defined space. State uses the Cartesian method of reasoning. From the state of doubt, the state establishes clear results, clear definitions. In other words, the state disseminates maxims, eternal truths. The war machine, on the other hand, is a grassroots movement that challenges the state and its Cartesian reasoning. The war machine is actually quite tricky to define because it questions the classic image of reason and logic. It has no fixed definition. The war machine is essentially that which escapes the state's order. It is the line of flight, a force that deterritorializes everything in its path. For Deleuze and Guattari, the war machine can be expressed in iconoclast thought. Thinkers like Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, or Blanchot engage in precisely the nomad thought. They propel the war machine. everybody should read Blanchot, basically. But how does the state react to the war machine then? Deleuze-Guattari write, the state tries to striate the space over which it reigns, or to utilize smooth spaces as a means of communication in the service of striated space. Essentially, the state tries to appropriate, contain, capture the war machine. For this reason, Deleuze-Guattari in the Proposition 10 claimed that the war machine is a secondary force, which does not have a defined essence. It is always a reaction to the state. It is a point of transition. The state, therefore, for Deleuze-Guattari is the initial, originary force. In the Proposition 11, Deleuze-Guattari are basically asking which social formation comes first. In other words, is there a historical evolution of social formations? Well, according to Deleuze-Guattari, there is no such thing as evolution of social formation. History for them is discontinuous. It is not the case that a primitive society precedes the state. All social relations function simultaneously. The development of a social formation does not have a teleological evolutionary design. Obviously, some primitive societies did assert tendencies towards centralization of the state. However, as Deleuze-Guattari note, these tendencies can be observed mostly in the cases where the primitive society is actively fighting this centralization. This means that the social formations are complex. A lot of different formations can function at once. Even the appearance of capitalism for Deleuze-Guattari is not a necessity. It's not a menacing historical development, but rather an accident. When disposable wealth met disposable labor, we, in a single stroke, as they say, we attained capitalism. Deleuze-Guattari write, all history does is to translate a coexistence of becomings into a succession. And collectivities can be transhuman, semi-sedentary, sedentary, or nomadic, without by the same token being preparatory stages for the state, which is already there, elsewhere, or beside. That is to say, social formations for Deleuze-Guattari, they coexist. Now, let's discuss Deleuze-Guattari's view of the differences between different urban centers. That is to say, the town and the state. First of all, the town and the state are both centralized, but the way these centers are organized are indeed different. The town is a network which is defined by its location, its interaction with other towns, or as Deleuze-Guattari put it, the town is defined by its entries and exits. The town is trans consistency. It links up different consistencies of different towns. Deleuze-Guattari writes, the town is the correlate of the road. The town exists only as a function of circulation and of circuits. The state, on the other hand, functions, as Deleuze-Guattari put it, by virtue of intraconsistency, which means that the state connects points that are not necessarily towns. It is a vertical organization of hierarchy, which ensures that distinct points resonate together. As Deleuze-Guattari put it, the state indeed proceeds otherwise. It is a phenomenon of intraconsistency. It makes points resonate together, points that are not necessarily already town poles, but very diverse points of order, geographic, ethnic, linguistic, moral, economic, technological particularities. In other words, the state forms a vertical, hierarchized mechanism that covers and organizes all networks and other points of order. In the Proposition 12, Deleuze-Guattari explored the concept of capture. More precisely, they are asking whether we can interpret primitive groups without such notions as stock, labor, or commodity. That is to say, Deleuze-Guattari want to know how do states capture other, perhaps more primitive social formations. They're analyzing how states force other social formations to enter into strictly organized, stratified, hierarchical system. Here, they differentiate between the idea of limit within a social formation and a threshold within a social formation. Limit is a form of exchange that a social formation can engage in and still preserve its unique design. In other words, the limit is the exchange which is still within the boundaries of a specific social formation. Threshold, on the other hand, is an exchange that totally changes, converts the social formation into something different or new. When referring to the concepts of limit and threshold, Deleuze-Guattari gives us an example of an alcoholic who has an idea of how many drinks he can have before he's no longer himself. The limit then is the last drink before the alcoholic is ruined, whereas the threshold is the drink that lies beyond that limit. It is a drink that will totally change the alcoholic's assemblage. His drinking patterns, his preferred drinks may even change. The social formations then also possess these limits and thresholds. They possess limits that ensure that they have a unique design. That being said, they also possess thresholds which can transform them. By manipulating these limits and thresholds, the other social formations, the despotic state, can capture them. The apparatus of capture then functions in three main ways. First, the despot takes over the land. That is, the state converts free territories into its own land. Second, the state takes the activities that are practiced in the primitive state and turns them into work. And finally, the third, the state replaces free exchange of goods with circulation of money, which is then controlled by the state. These are essentially the three ways in which the state uses the apparatus of capture. At this point, we should discuss capitalism in more detail. Capitalism is another form of machine of capture. As we already saw, the state form captures all primitive exchanges and overcodes them. It extracts rent from land. It taxes the people to fund bureaucracies. However, while the state is trying to overcode the flow of money, some of the money will inevitably escape. This is precisely how private property begins to manifest. This implies that capitalism undermines the state as a sole owner, manager of wealth. Rent, in the context of capitalism, can suddenly be extracted by anyone who owns anything. As Deleuze-Guattari put it, capitalism requires the marriage of unqualified labor and unqualified wealth. This means that capitalism decodes the flows of property and ownership. Money as a common denominator for all commercial transactions becomes free from despot, the despotic phase. Money, in other words, becomes the new deterritorialized and actively deterritorializing force. However, that doesn't mean that people within capitalism are emancipated. Yes, the despot or the state is no longer the only force that dictates or overcodes. However, now people are enslaved to the capitalist axiomatic. We need to, in other words, participate in the consumer world, which means that everything, all our values, are compared to the common denominator, the white wall, which we also know as money. Capitalism is therefore a very peculiar apparatus of capture in that it is deterritorialized. It escapes its own capture. It always finds its own way out. In my opinion, this chapter is particularly good at showing how complex the apparatus of capture really is. It shows us how systems of signification such as money, states, or urban centers organize our space. This chapter also makes clear that if we want to reform the policies of the modern nation-state, we cannot be naive. We cannot use historical evolutionism in our critique. We cannot resort to a Manichean understanding of society as made up of the good people and the evil people. We need to generate something truly new, perhaps a proper war machine, a new form of nomad thought. Thank you for watching. See you next time.